Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire our conversations. I'm Dr. Philip Brown, and I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Terry Jackson, with you at the intersection. The interesting thing about intersections is that we all face many intersections every day. The way we navigate these determines the trajectory of our days and our lives. We're really excited today, and I'd say a bit courageous, as we're doing two brand new things at the same time. We're doing our first true live episode, and we're including our first guest. And I'm so inspired today by our first guest, Sally Helgesen. She is a premier expert on women's leadership, a best-selling author and international speaker, and she's going to talk to you today about not just women in leadership, but also about the whole concept of inclusive leadership. So without further ado, we will bring Sally into the picture. Sally, welcome to the intersection.
Well, thank you so much, Philip and Terry. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I love this idea of the intersection. That's where we all are now, and we're all trying to figure out how to make it work in the most powerful way we can.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for being a guest. I think it was some years ago when you and I met, and we've had some powerful conversations. But, most importantly to me was your work, your purpose behind your work and your passion behind your work. And that's why I've gained as much admiration for you as I have, because you're always at the intersection, as we say, but you're always tackling those tough conversations as well.
Exactly. And it's interesting reflecting back. I came into this work in women's leadership 35 years ago with the book, The Female Advantage, Women's Ways of Leadership, which was the first to focus on what women had to contribute rather than how they needed to change and adapt. And that had come out of my own experience working in corporate communications during the 1980s and noticing what a poor job the organizations I was part of did at understanding what women had to contribute as leaders. So it's been a pretty consistent thread that has broadened out to the larger topic of inclusion over the years. But really, I have been fired by the mission from the very start of being able to help women and other people who are outside the standard leadership mainstream to recognize, articulate, and act on their greatest strengths and help leaders understand what those strengths are so they can build more inclusive organizations.
Well, I want to let our listeners know that Sally has an unbelievable website with a great blog, and I did a lot of study on it, getting ready for the thing. And one of the things that just struck me right out of the gate of one of your recent posts was about the Old Boys Network. And as somebody who unfortunately has begun to look like part of the Old Boys Network, I just would like for you to share with our listeners a little bit about that and how folks can navigate that in a more effective way.
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I did write about it in one of my most recent newsletters, if not the most recent, how to navigate the Old Boys Network, around and with the Old Boys Network. In many organizations, the Old Boys Network is fairly established, and I would say in the last 7 to 10 years, it has often opened up a little bit to include people that don't necessarily look like or have the same background or experience as the standard old boys who ran most organizations up through 2010 or so. But despite that, despite the fact that it can look a little more inclusive, Old Boys networks tend to be self-reinforcing. Their strength is that they really are about leveraging relationships, and that's their purpose. It's not just building relationships, it's how people within them leverage relationships. Their weakness is that they tend to be not very inclusive and not very open. And this causes problems for people who are outside the mainstream, who are looking at the possibility of enhancing and building their own leadership strengths, how to get in. And it's hard to get in. And what I really recommend, because I've seen it work over the many decades I've been doing this work, is that start building your own network. Start building your own network internally with peers and colleagues. Start, very importantly, building your own network externally with people in your field, because this is what gives you strength. This is what you can forge connections that are as powerful, and you can get as much information and advice if you're willing to do the work that comes with building your own network. So that's really where we want to put our energy, not complaining about the old boys network. Okay, it exists. It's an issue. And it can operate in a way that's very exclusive. But what we can do in the face of this is to build our own networks. I'm big on what we can control rather than all the many issues that can concern us.
You know, Sally, I couldn't agree more with you because I look at it from two perspectives. The first perspective is, of course, for a lot of old boy networks, I'm just not going to fit. And I understand that I'm not going to fit. But then the question I ask is one of my favorite questions. How do I make it work? How do I still achieve what I'm seeking to achieve? And that probably is one of the reasons that Dr. Brown and I connected as friends. And as you say, create your own network, which, of course, our friend Marshall Goldsmith says the same thing. Hey, we have the Marshall Goldsmith 100, but create your own networks in your own local areas that will allow you to continue to do the work. So the question I have for you is, in creating your own network, what are the consequences, or what are the pros and the cons of, one, creating an inclusive network, which I know that's, or not creating an inclusive network? How do we help navigate and possibly eliminate the status quo?
Well, I think that the way we navigate the status quo is to build up our own strength. The one thing that I have noticed over the 35 years I've been in this field of inclusion and leadership is that the way organizations are most likely to change is when they're drawing from a more diverse leadership pool. So it's a kind of chicken and the egg thing. I always advocate doing what you can to build up your own strength. I often get feedback where people say, well, isn't that just playing into the game, you know, of not taking it on, of not taking the system on? Well, no, it's not, because first of all, it's very difficult to make systemic changes when you don't have real influence and positional power. Our friend Marshall always quotes Peter Drucker as saying, the person who gets to make the decision is the person in the position to make the decision. That is not necessarily the best person, not necessarily the wisest person. That's the person that gets to make the decision. So what we want to do is to increase the likelihood that we will have greater decision-making power, greater influence, and greater visibility in our organization, our community, whatever sphere we're operating in, our university. So by doing that, we to some degree, if we build strong networks, create alternate centers of power. So our organizations become more web-like in their structure rather than so hierarchical and so limited. So that's a good thing. But also we increase our own likelihood of getting into a position where we can really make a substantive difference. So that's really, I think, a more effective way to think of it. And that's why in my new book, Rising Together, I make a big distinction between what are networks and what are grapevines. Grapevines are usually systems where we share information from a point of powerlessness. And this is how they have evolved over time. But in that way, because they disseminate and share information, grapevines have a certain degree of power. But they are often, one of the characteristics of them is that they're an alternate center of power that of people who have no power. So and they often, as a result, default to complaint. One example, let me be more specific. I give a wonderful example in the book that if you read my newsletter, you probably heard about, and it's in the new book. Of what's called the Allori Sisterhood, which is a group of African-American political operatives in New York State. And they, had, they found themselves excluded from a major meeting by the Latino and African-American men who are also political operatives. They found themselves excluded from a major meeting, and they were this about 10 or 12 years ago. They didn't even get the notification. So they decided to create their own meeting. And the men who excluded them actually crashed the meeting. So they decided to start meeting in one another's homes. And what they did was they took a very deliberative approach to being a network rather than a grapevine, in that they made the decision that what they were going to do was to leverage one another's connections to build support for one another in terms of getting into more powerful positions. Share relationships, share connections, share information. Oh, here's a job. I'm going to recommend you for this. Our whole group is going to stand behind you and help you prep for your interview for that. And the result has been that the network, the Allori Sisterhood, is still together after 12 years. And they have placed women in positions of real power, including the chief of communications in the Biden administration. These were people who were knocking on doors 12 years ago. So it really worked. And I think the two lessons we can take from that network are, number one, focus on leveraging the relationships you have. And number two, don't get caught in feeling excluded from the power structure. Create your own power structure. And over time, that can develop very powerfully.
So connected to that, Sally, is the whole concept of allyship. So let's take the situation where maybe you got one or more of the people in the groups you're talking about, the own network, develop some strong allies within the old boy network. What would that look like?
Well, and in fact, that's what happened. But guess what happened? The old boys network members started coming to them because they saw that they were successfully leveraging the power they had and getting into positions of influence. So more of what that teaches us is that more effective than feeling, oh, we're excluded, we're not part of that. What are we going to do? Why won't they let us in? They're, not behaving inclusively. They're shutting us out. Rather than that, the idea was, okay, let's create the conditions where we can have more power and influence, and then they'll come to us. And that's exactly what happened. And that's how things evolve. I do have one other thing to say that's interesting about building these external networks that are alternate centers of power, is that research shows, particularly that done by Dr. Boris Groysberg at Harvard, I think it's the School of Education, not School of Business, although he mostly writes about business. But he did some really interesting studies of Wall Street analysts and what made their skills portable. And what he discovered, this is a huge, major study that he published, a big, thick book called Chasing Stars. Sorry. And what he discovered is that generally the men who were star analysts did a very poor job of carrying their ability to be star analysts to different organizations. whereas the women did a pretty good job of it. And in digging down, he had no way, this was very quantitative, his research, he had no way to account for that difference. So he started doing some interviews and more qualitative stuff with women. And what he discovered was there were a number of reasons. First of all, the women really looked at the new culture. You know, if they were at one investment firm and they got an offer from another, they really looked at the culture and thought, is there a fit? Where the men tended to be like, oh, okay, it's a no-brainer, they're offering me X amount of more money. So they were more aware and cognizant of culture. But the other thing he found is that they had external networks that really helped them, whereas the men tended to be very connected in the old boys network internally in their organizations because they had access to it, and it didn't help them when they were out, when they were in other organizations. So they kind of had to start over from scratch. So in terms of building a career where your skills are portable, external networks are also very powerful.
That is awesome. And you know, Sally, it's interesting that you mentioned that because back in 2016, I did some work with 20 women executives at a large insurance company. And what I found in my research and as I prepared was that women over the age of 40, compared to their men counterparts, were much better leaders from a EQ perspective, simply because some were mothers, and that whole nurturing aspect that came into not only nurturing children at home, but nurturing their employees, as well as being more empathetic to others in the workplace. You know, you have a great book titled How Women Rise, which I've read, which is outstanding. And as we talk about inclusion, and I'm sure some of the younger audience who are out in the corporate world, the younger women would like to know, what are some of the steps that they could try to avoid that would enable them to rise and to be more inclusive in the workplace?
So this is advice for younger women in terms of being able to rise and be more inclusive in the workplace?
Yeah, I would say yes, simply because some of them are just entering the workspace. They don't have that experience. And if they were, I guess, newbies, for lack of a better word, going in, how could they hit the ground running and understand the power of inclusiveness? And what advice could you give to them?
Well, I think the advice I would give to them first would be threefold. One is focus on your own strengths. Get a sense of what those strengths are as soon as you can in your work life. It takes a while to recognize that. But if you're looking for it, if you're constantly sort of asking, you know, what was my strength in that meeting? What could I have done differently? How could I have been better, more powerful? How could I have displayed my strengths? So what you really want to do is look at your strengths and then figure out how well you are, how you can articulate those strengths, so you can be very, very clear about that. And that's a really good way to do it, because then you start attracting other people. Secondly is to never undervalue the power of building relationships and building relationships broadly. I think one of the issues that has arisen in the last 10 years is there's been so much emphasis on mentors and sponsors, which is very important, of course, but it has been so emphasized that people have often forgotten that strong relationships benefit you when they are built at every single level. So you want to be as inclusive as possible in building relationships. You know, it's not just that transactional thing of you never know where someone else is going to end up. It's also, as you build relationships more broadly and you become more skilled at dealing with people who may have very different backgrounds from yourself, you develop allies, as Dr. Brown was talking about, in unexpected places, and that can help so much. as long as you're looking at it from the perspective of, how can I be of benefit to you as well? So that's really key. And the third thing, was I'm kind of reminded of it by the beginning of your question, where you talked about, in your observation, women leaders had developed more empathy from the experience of being mothers and sort of their domestic role. And I find that to be very true. I also hear a lot of younger women going on about, I don't know how I can do this and have a family. I don't think my job is aligned with being a mother. Maybe I need to choose, etc. We don't need to choose. Those skills are so translatable. And one of the stories that I most love, I was reading a profile of Nancy Pelosi in the Washington Post maybe 2 years ago. And the interview was about how she was managing this very fractious, large caucus and doing so superbly. And the interviewer asked her, he said, well, I'm assuming you have the ability to lead such a diverse and clamorous group of people because of the experience of your father, who was, I believe, the mayor of Baltimore and went on to be a congressman. So it was a very political environment she grew up in. And she said, watching my dad was helpful. She said, but what has really enabled me to lead this caucus is the fact that I had 5 children in 6 years. She said, if you can be a mother to 5 children in 6 years, you can manage anything. You can manage a war. You can manage a government. You can do it. And I just love that quote, because that really, one of the things that, to me, women have brought into the workplace is a permission to recognize that we all are full human beings. We have families. We have concerns that lie outside the workplace. I remember back in the 80s, women being told, don't put a picture of your kids on your desk. That will undermine your ability to be seen as a professional. I remember women having to duck out of major meetings to take a tiny, quick 1-minute call that had anything to do with their children, a babysitter being sick, etc. And that's not true anymore. Men and women, all of us, bring, the whole idea is bring your whole self to work. And often we develop talents and skills and connections in the community through our personal lives. So I think we need to recognize that we can, maybe we can't do it all at the same time. Although Nancy Pelosi was pretty busy while she was having her babies, but maybe we can't do it all at the same time, but we really can find individual ways to have a satisfying personal life and a satisfying professional life, and both are important.
Such a great discussion, and I've so many questions. I've got 2 parallel lines of thought going, but I want to take one. We kind of live in a world of paradoxes, right? It's certainly not an either or world. There are lots of ways things can happen, but the paradox I want to ask you about is, as a healthcare guy, I'm a surgeon by training, healthcare system executive now. One of the things we know for sure is that the top influencers for what happens to a family or a unit of any kind are the women. The number one influencer of the way someone seeks health care or how well they take care of them is always a female figure, often the maternal figure. Yeah. But yet in corporate world, we see something dramatically different. So it's a sort of a 2-part question. Why is that? And then what happens to bring balance to that? Because we know it's effective.
Well, it's a big structural question, particularly related to healthcare, that often has to do with the buy-up. I mean, I'm experiencing it in my own hospital system, got bought by a huge system that has massive amounts of debt in order to take it on. So all the decisions that are made are driven by the fact that they have the new parent, which is located half a nation away, is trying to deal with the debt from that leveraged buyout. So those are the kinds of structural decisions that are influencing the healthcare system now. We're certainly seeing it in nursing homes, where there's a huge buy-up, often by hedge funds, of nursing homes, and so the money gets funneled away. So that's a structural issue in our late capitalist environment that is having a particular impact upon healthcare, I would suggest. And you're much more of an expert on this than I am, but it's having an impact on it, and it is keeping it in a kind of, I don't want to say male-centric way, but it's bringing in an aspect of hierarchy and control, command and control, that is keeping not only women down, but a lot of other people. I mean, I've heard this from, the guy administering the MRIs. He said, our goal here is to provide excellent customer service. Then the suits, as he calls them, visit us. And what they tell us is we've got to perform more MRIs in a day. And those two things don't work. So I think that we've got some structural healthcare issues here that make this arena particularly difficult. And there's some long-term solutions, but it is interesting. And when you were talking about the healthcare decisions being driven by women, what I also realize is that in marketing and advertising, something like 85% of all decisions about what to buy, what to purchase, including cars, are made by women. And yet the marketing and the distribution is done with the idea of a male customer. And they're awkward about how to address the female customer. So I think these are, they're different issues, because one is very structural and the other is just a kind of lack of imagination, really, the marketing and advertising world. But these are things that are holding back our ability to forge organizations that are more engaging to more people. And I think that's why the Gallup, even before the pandemic in 2018, that stunning Gallup survey that showed that something like 65% of people reported feeling totally unengaged at work, and another 20% mildly unengaged. So you had something like 18% of people being highly engaged. That's an issue. The good news is that organizations are starting to recognize that is an issue. If healthcare continues down this path, they're not going to be able to get anybody to work there. So that becomes an issue, especially as this country closes down a lot of immigration. So it's, the problem is on track to start to break some systems. And when that happens, then you can get a new pool of leadership. And that's what it often takes.
And you hit on somewhere in that commentary, you talked about the concept of lack of imagination. And I think that lack of imagination is one of the most important imperatives we need to understand in the realm of inclusion. That current lack of imagination, it can be fixed.
Well, that's exactly right. And the lack of imagination really ties very much to the points Terry was making about empathy. Mm-hmm. Because what is empathy really? It is the ability to, at the basic level, put yourself in another person's shoes. And how do we put ourselves in another person's shoes? We do that by imagining what their experience is. We do that by imagining the factors that brought them to think and act and behave and feel in the way that they feel. So it is empathy is really an act of imagination. And I think that it is often blocked by fear. And that's one thing I see, in the diversity and inclusion space, is that there's a lot of fear right now that you're going to get shut down if you possibly say the wrong thing, if you possibly appear the wrong way, etc. And this is blanket. And this is something that I think is causing some problems. But the imagination and the empathy that results from imagination is the way out of this, because that fear freezes us from understanding what another person's reality and experience is like, causes us to emphasize the differences. And I hear this, from men sometimes, well, I can't put myself in a woman's shoes. Ha ha ha. Okay, fine, that's cute, but what are you saying? You so lack imagination that you can only imagine your own experience. And it's fear that causes them to say that. I believe, fear that they're going to get pushed back or they're going to do it wrong, so they default. And this is why, in my new book, I really emphasize behaviors and how we can behave in ways that maximize our ability to create inclusive organizations and build relationships, strong relationships across a huge variety of boundaries.
It's interesting that you said that some of the men would say, so what am I going to do? Put myself in the shoes of a woman? I can't do that. One of the greatest gifts that I say that I've ever received was the fact that I have a daughter. And so from a man's perspective, having a daughter, yeah, you have to kind of put yourself in a woman's shoes because you want her to have the best life experiences possible, right? And you mentioned imagination as Dr. Brown mentioned it, and you mentioned fear. And so I like to say that the underpinning of all of that is courage.
Yes.
How can we get all people to have the courage to put themselves in other people's shoes? And to that male, I would say, so what is it like to be a human being? I don't necessarily have to go to gender, right? And well, she's a woman, I'm a man. But what does it mean to you as a human being? How would you feel if someone treated you a particular way? We have to have that courage. Is there any advice you can give us around having this courage to overcome the fear so that we can, as I like to say, we need to have these conversations?
My experience, we build courage through small steps, through incrementally doing something, asking somebody after a meeting who you might have seen that they had made a remark and nobody acknowledged it. Asking them afterwards, could you explain that a little more? That was an interesting point you raised, and I noticed that it kind of got overlooked. Could you explain that a little more? Or that was an interesting point you made. How did you come to that conclusion? What was your thinking there? So you're reaching out in a very specific way. You're not offering sympathy. Oh, I feel so bad for you. You didn't get blah, blah, blah. No, you're demonstrating the courage of curiosity. And curiosity and courage are often well aligned. We don't think of them that way, but they are. So I think when we begin a practice of asking those kinds of small questions, because we notice something that happened, we notice that somebody was stereotyped in a situation, and we ask a question like, not so much how did that make you feel, because it's a very general question, but I noticed that remark seemed to me to be rather stereotyping. What was your response? Did you feel that way as well? And then get into that conversation. We all have unconscious biases. And in Rising Together, one of the people that I interviewed was our colleague, Terry Bev Wright, who is part of the MG 100, and she has taken on this thing called this wonderful thing called Dallas Dinner Table, where they bring together people from all sectors in leadership positions in Dallas. She was at IBM there, to have real conversations. The guiding principle is come as you are. And she talks about her experience of going to her first one and there was a white man from East Texas there with a very strong East Texas accent. And she grew up in Dallas, but her family was from East Texas. And she said, I had the experience in the summer of seeing how my father and my grandfather were treated. She said, so my first thought was, I am not going to sit next to this guy with the East Texas accent. I don't want to hear him. I know who and how he is. And of course, she was seated next to him. And she said, we got into one of the most profound conversations of my life. She said, because we both talked about our experience of East Texas and how different it was. And she said, I came to see that he had been, as a child, imprinted by this totally racist assumptions that underlay the society and culture he was part of. He was just like me. He was a child who had been imprinted with this. She said, and through the evening, we were able to have such a rich discussion. And so I think it's exposure too. Put yourself in situations where you're going to meet people who have a different experience than you do, and remain open to being able to listen to what that is. So I think that these small steps are what build courage, and then we get in the habit. Once we get in a habit, we have a practice, we have a way that we act in these situations. We have go-to questions that we ask in these situations because they've been effective in the past. So I think that's how we build courage. We don't suddenly have courage. It doesn't come to us overnight. We don't, wake up one morning and say, I'm brave.
Right.
The
That's
kind
right.
of self-affirmation.
That's right.
That's right.
The self-affirmation, I am brave, I am worthy, and all this. That's fine. That's nice. But, the important thing is to be able to find out what works and then deepen that practice.
So powerful, this conversation about the linkage of courage and curiosity. And of course, we've done episodes on curiosity and courage. And, it's not a new concept. A guy named Rudyard Kipling wrote about it in a child's story called Rikki Tikki Tavi, right? Said the hardest thing in the world is to frighten a mongoose because he's eaten up from nose to tail with curiosity. He is literally too curious to be scared. And so it's not a new concept, right? It's like, we have known that curiosity is a powerful antidote to fear and a fortifier of courage. So, how do we make that transition back becomes the question in my mind. Like, it's not new. Maybe we've forgotten about it. And so many of these things that we've talked about today are concepts that are basically incontrovertible. But maybe we have forgotten to bring them to the forefront of what we do. Maybe the right intersection has not occurred to bring it back to the forefront of our thinking of how we conduct our lives and our business processes.
Well, I love that. That I'd forgotten about the mongoose too, and I was just kind of riffing. And these are human concepts. These are part of what humanity has learned over its very bloody and divisive millennia. This is part of what we've learned. We've learned that curiosity and courage are connected. We've learned that small steps are how we build our capacity, not just for courage, but for having strong conversations, for examining what our own biases may be and finding ways to address them. So we've known these things. So I think what Terry said before is so important. How does this feel to you as a human? We get into, and for me, one of the best things that has ever happened are the employee resource groups and organizations, because they've given people fantastic networks. They started off as, just kind of like, well, you go over there and talk about that, but they have become a real force for change in organizations. So I not only have enormous respect, but most of my work has been really through ERGs over the last 15 years or even 20 years. However, I think that ERGs can benefit by asking Terry's question more. How does this feel to me as a human being? Because we get into thinking, as a woman, as an African-American woman, or a Black woman, I should say, because so many people who are, part of this situation are from the Caribbean or Africa or UK. How does this feel to me as an ex? Important question, but we also need, how does this happen to me, feel to me as a human? And I think that because to some degree, it's become so common to talk about, well, how this feels to me as a woman, we now have the evolution of a backlash. Well, how does this feel to me as a white man? As a white man, I have this, and I'm, this sort of idea, I'm the true victim here. We need a little more reverse privilege in all these conversations. We need a little more of, how does this feel to me as a human being? Right. And that's what's missing, particularly from our national conversation, I have to say, about, how does this feel to me as a human?
And we see this, there's this thing that we talk about now a lot, which is I need to bring my authentic self to everything. And, that always misses one thing. And you see it, the white men are the worst about this, and I can say that as one, is that there's a reciprocal obligation to allow my truth to be impacted by the truth of others with whom I interact. And until we begin to understand that phenomenon a lot better and put it into action, then we're going to struggle with a lot of these things like lack of curiosity, because I've got more of a homogenous world. We're going to struggle with things, like lack of imagination, because where's it going to come from? I mean, talk a little bit about, about that phenomenon, about bringing your whole self, but understanding interdependence, right? Like interdependence has never been more important in the history of the world, because knowledge is doubling every 12 hours. We can't possibly be masters of almost anything, so we're interdependent.
Well, I love that connection you made. It's really, the idea is bring your authentic self to work or wherever, but if you're doing that in a way that says, well, this is how I feel, this is how I was raised, this is my experience, end of story, then, as you say, you're not allowing for other people to have an experience. So the key there, of course, is curiosity. Well, this is how I grew up. This is what happened with Bev Wright and the guy from East Texas. This is how I grew up. I'm curious about what your experience there was. So I think there's a little bit too much categorical, this is how I am, this is how I was raised, this is, that we see a bit too much of that, and that cuts off empathy, imagination, curiosity. So those are the ways we don't cultivate that. But there's another thing in terms of work. I happen to feel that the endless emphasis on authenticity at work is in danger of undermining what makes us successful at work. And that is professionalism, professional behavior, professional competence, as opposed to just a sort of free-floating confidence, which we see a lot of at the leadership level, totally untethered to competence, and taking pride in our professionalism. Mm-hmm. What strikes me about professionalism is people can be professional at every single level in any kind of position or job. We can be professional. And I think that authenticity often underplays the importance of professional standards, professional behavior, etc. I really do think that. Our friend Marshall Goldsmith always says, showing up as when you're a Broadway actor and you have a show that night and you don't feel well, you don't walk out there on stage and say, well, I don't feel very well and I'm having trouble getting into this role and blah, blah, blah. No, you're a professional. You show up, you inhabit the role, you do the best you can with the skills that you have spent a lifetime cultivating. it's and the authenticity movement almost would have us go out on stage and say, well, I don't feel very well right now. That's me expressing my authentic self.
That's right.
So I think, it's really helpful to think about, add professionalism into this mix of what we're talking about in regard to curiosity, to imagination and empathy.
Yeah, I think another trending movement that is inhibiting all of that is also cancel culture, because that is inhibiting conversations because people say, well, we just don't want to have that conversation. Well, if you don't have the courage, the curiosity, or the imagination to have the conversation, guess where we're going to be? Exactly where we are right now. And so we have to kind of we have to get away from this whole I'm gonna call it the cancel culture movement.
Boy, do I agree with you on that. I mean, first of all, people are often afraid to have conversations because if they say something wrong, it's going to blow up. And next thing they know, they're going to be on social media and people are going to be harassing them. Or if they're in the workplace, they're going to be called in by HR. We all make mistakes, and cluelessness and tactlessness are not really hanging offenses. And that's part of what cancel culture really is oriented toward. So I think some of the language, and this is something that I think is particularly concerning at the college level, because a lot of young people are getting the idea in college that they need to focus on microaggressions, as they're called. Microaggressions usually amount to what I talked about before: tactlessness and cluelessness, because they're micro. They're not overt racist policies. They're not overt sexual harassment, not at all. They're little things that could be better. So that focus is problematic. The other focus, and this is something I talk about in my book that's coming out in February, Rising Together, is that this kind of started with the idea that, kids can say, oh, this is triggering me. If they're in a literature class and they don't like, the mongoose, because you say, well, this is triggering me because Rudyard Kipling was a colonialist, whatever, in India. Okay, fine. That's good. But we're, once we get into adult life, once we get into this rough and tumble workplace, we are triggered constantly.
Yes.
And if we don't find, and this is really one of the things the book is about, if we don't find effective ways to deal with common triggers, we will never reach our full potential.
That's right.
We will never have the capacity to position ourselves for real leadership. We will remain stuck in, I can't handle this, I can't do this, which is the opposite of courage.
That's right.
It's almost teaching kids that you don't want to have courage. You want to emphasize, I'm triggered, I've got to leave, you've got to stop, we can't read this book, etc. So it's shifted now. Different factions have picked it up in different ways, but it's so inappropriate given what the workplace is evolving into. It's really not preparing kids well.
Absolutely. This is such a great conversation. We could probably go on for hours, but I know we don't have that kind of time. I want to give our listeners a chance to know how to find you. So, whether it's social media profile or your book coming out, what can you tell our listening and viewing audience about where to find Sally Helgesen?
Well, I'm pretty easy to find. My website is Sally Helgesen, and I have lots of material on that. I also have a contact button, and I have links through to Facebook, to LinkedIn, and to Twitter. I have been on LinkedIn for quite a while. I tend to particularly respond to Twitter. I find it interesting right now, even as it's melting down. It's been a good platform because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. And, following some of the next gen political operatives has been very, very inspiring. in terms of, the conversation we were just having about university students and the triggering and the microaggressions. But what I'm also seeing is this next generation of kids, in terms of their political awareness and their environmental awareness, is extraordinary. It is incredible. We've got people who are sophomores at UCLA who have influential blogs about political reality. We have coordinated efforts across the United States to bring students to not only to vote, but to support what's going on in Georgia now. It is remarkable to witness, and you can really see it there. But I'm getting off the question of how to get so those links are there. The contact button is there. The contact button lets me know if you've sent me an email. So I'm pretty easy to find and pretty easy to get in touch with.
Well, we certainly appreciate your time today, sharing your wisdom with our audience, the chance to have a great conversation. And we also thank our listeners for taking the time today. And we always close up by saying you can find us at unlikelyintersection.com. You can find us on Facebook at Unlikely Intersections. You can find me on LinkedIn at Doc Philip Brown. And Terry.
You can find me at LinkedIn at Terry Jackson, PhD, as well as on Facebook. And Sally, as always, it was a great conversation, a lot of great insights. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, because you've really stirred my thinking. This conversation about curiosity and imagination and empathy, the example of the mongoose, Terry, what you were talking about having a daughter requiring you to put yourself in, to imagine yourself as that child and understand those experiences. I think all of this was very rich conversation for me, and I will carry this with me. So I want to thank you for inviting me and for me being, I believe, the first guest that you have on this podcast.
Absolutely. And we hope that you'll come check us out at more intersections in the future.
That's right.
Beautiful.